The language everyone speaks and almost nobody reads. Every day, you are surrounded by messages, not the ones in your phone, not the ones your colleagues send in emails or the announcements that scroll across the news. The messages I'm talking about are older, richer, and infinitely more revealing than anything ever put into words. They are transmitted in the angle of a person's shoulders, in the micro-expression that flickers across someone's face for a fraction of a second before the rehearsed smile replaces it, in the words someone chooses, and the ones they conspicuously avoid, in the gap between what a person says they believe and what their behavior, repeated over time, actually reveals. This is the hidden language, and it is being spoken constantly by every human being you have ever met, including you. The question is not whether it is being communicated. The question is whether you are equipped to read it. Most people are not because they lack intelligence. Many brilliant people are remarkably poor at reading others, not because the skill is impossibly rare. Millions of people develop it to extraordinary levels, often through necessity rather than formal study, but because the hidden language is almost never taught. Schools teach grammar and mathematics. Parents teach manners and morals. But almost nobody sits a young person down and teaches them the actual mechanics of how human beings work, what drives behavior beneath the surface, how deception operates and how to detect it, why people present one face in public and live another in private, and how to navigate all of this with clarity, compassion, and confidence. This book is that missing education. Over 8 chapters, we will go deep into 8 dimensions of human psychology and social intelligence that most people never formally study. We will explore how to read a person's true character from their behavior patterns rather than their self-presentation. We will examine the mechanics of manipulation, how it works, who deploys it, and exactly how to neutralize it. We will study body language and nonverbal communication, not as a party trick for guessing moods, but as a systematic, evidence-based tool for understanding what is actually being communicated beneath what is being said. We will investigate the psychology of trust, how it is genuinely built, how it is systematically destroyed, and how to assess whether the trust you are placing in someone is warranted. We will unpack the hidden dynamics of social power, who holds it, how they maintain it, and how people with no formal authority command rooms and shape outcomes. We will look at emotional intelligence not as a soft concept, but as a hard skill with specific, learnable components. We will examine the art of influence, the ethical, deeply human ability to move people toward better outcomes. And finally, we will bring it all together in the most important skill of all, knowing yourself well enough that none of it can be used against you. The great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." He was speaking about internal psychology, but the principle applies equally to the social world. Until you understand the hidden dynamics operating in your relationships, your workplace, and your social environment, they will operate on you, shaping your outcomes, your emotions, and your choices, and you will call it luck or circumstance. Understanding the hidden language does not make you cynical. It does not turn every relationship into a calculation or every person into a puzzle to be solved. Quite the opposite. People who genuinely understand human nature tend to be more compassionate, not less, because they understand the fear, the conditioning, and the unmet needs that drive most human behavior. They are more patient, more forgiving, and more genuinely effective in their relationships, precisely because they see people more clearly. What understanding the hidden language does make you is free. Free from manipulation you did not know was happening. Free from the confusion of trying to respond to what people say rather than what they mean. Free from the social anxiety that comes from not understanding the rules of a game that everyone around you seems to be playing fluently. The language is all around you. It always has been. Let us learn to read it together. Chapter 1. The Character Code. How to read who someone really is before they tell you. In 1954, a young psychologist named George Kelly proposed a theory of personality that turned the dominant academic models on their head. Most psychology at the time focused on what people were like, their fixed traits, their measurable characteristics, their position on various dimensions of personality. Kelly proposed something more useful, that what mattered was not what people were like, but the constructs through which they interpreted the world, the personal lenses, built from experience, through which every person filtered every event and made every decision. He understood something that experienced human observers had known for centuries and that formal psychology was only beginning to articulate. That the most revealing thing about any person is not what they say about themselves, but the patterns of meaning they consistently impose on their experience. In other words, the most reliable way to understand who someone is to watch what they do, not once, but consistently across different situations over time. This sounds obvious. It is remarkably rarely practiced. Most people evaluate other people primarily on the basis of first impressions, stated intentions, and self-presentation. The carefully curated version of themselves that most human beings put forward in early or formal interactions. And then they are surprised when the reality that emerges over time differs significantly from the introduction. The great American writer Maya Angelou put it with a directness she was known for. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. She was not advising suspicion or cynicism. She was advising attention. The specific kind of attention that watches behavior rather than listening only to words, and that trusts the data of what people actually do over the story of who they say they are. There are 5 behavioral patterns that reveal character more reliably than almost anything else a person could tell you about themselves. The first is how someone treats people who have no power over their outcomes. The colleague who is warm and charming with superiors but dismissive of servers, cleaners, or administrative staff is not a warm and charming person. They are a performer of warmth for strategic purposes. True character shows most clearly in interactions where no social reward is available. Watch how a person treats the waiter who made a mistake. The customer service representative they will never speak to again. The person standing on the street asking for help. The second pattern is consistency between public and private behavior. Most people present their best selves in evaluative or social situations. The question is not what they present when they know they are being observed, but what they do when they believe they are not. This is genuinely difficult to observe directly, but it reveals itself indirectly, over time, in the small inconsistencies between what someone claims to value and what their choices in unobserved moments reveal. The person who claims to value honesty but tells small convenient lies when it costs them nothing significant to do so. The person who claims to be generous but finds every reason to let someone else pick up the bill. The third pattern is how someone handles being wrong. The response to error, criticism, and correction is among the most diagnostic behavioral signals available. The person who responds to being wrong with defensiveness, deflection, blame shifting, or aggressive counterattack is telling you something fundamental about their relationship reality. They prioritize the protection of their self-image over the pursuit of truth. The person who responds with genuine consideration, appropriate accountability, and an updated position is telling you something equally fundamental. They are more interested in being accurate than in being right. The fourth pattern, and one of the most underestimated, is what happens to a person when they are under stress. Stress is a biochemical solvent that dissolves the social performance layer and reveals the operating system beneath. The person who has carefully curated a persona of patience and equanimity in normal conditions will, under sufficient stress, revert to their more deeply conditioned responses. Pay attention to people in difficult situations. When things go wrong, when they are tired, when they are under pressure, when they are scared. What you see then is closer to who they actually are than almost anything you will see in their best moments. The fifth pattern is the arc of their relationships over time. Do the people who have known this person longest, not met them most recently, speak of them with warmth and respect? Do their older friendships deepen, or do they have a pattern of exits and estrangements that they consistently explain as other people's failures? The person who has a long trail of broken relationships and a consistent explanation for why each one ended with the other party at fault is giving you a character signal that no amount of current charm should override. Abraham Lincoln, who developed one of the most accurate and penetrating abilities to read people of any leader in history, which he had to, governing a deeply divided nation through its most catastrophic crisis, said, "Character is like a tree and reputation is like a shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. Study the tree, not the shadow it casts. Because eventually, in enough situations, under enough pressure, over enough time, the tree is all that remains." Chapter 2. The Invisible Hand. Understanding manipulation. How it works and how to stop it cold. There is a pattern so common in human relationships that researchers in psychology have given it a clinical name, and yet most people who experience it, sometimes for years, cannot find words for what is happening to them. They only know that they consistently feel confused, responsible for problems they did not create, and somehow smaller than they were before a particular relationship began. They know something is wrong. They cannot say precisely what. The pattern is manipulation, not the crude, obvious variety, the blatant lie, the physical threat, the transparent bribery. These are easy to identify and respond to. The manipulation that does the deepest damage is subtle, systematic, and delivered with enough plausible deniability that the person experiencing it is left doubting not the manipulator, but themselves. Robert Cialdini, the social psychologist whose landmark research on influence and persuasion has shaped both marketing and psychology for 40 years, identified 6 principles through which human behavior is reliably influenced: reciprocity, commitment, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. These principles in themselves are ethically neutral. They describe how human minds work, not how they are being exploited. But in the hands of a skilled manipulator, each one becomes a lever. Reciprocity, the deeply wired human tendency to return what has been given, becomes the unsolicited gift that creates an obligation you never agreed to. Commitment, the psychological pressure to remain consistent with position once stated, becomes a foot-in-the-door technique that progressively escalates requests. Social proof, the tendency to look to others to determine correct behavior, becomes false consensus, the invented impression that everyone agrees, everyone is doing it, you are the outlier for hesitating. Authority, the tendency to defer to expertise, becomes a manufactured credential, the implied status, the borrowed legitimacy that was never earned. But beyond these specific tactics, there are deeper patterns that define manipulative relationships. Patterns that, once recognized, are almost impossible to unsee. The first is Darvo, a term coined by psychologist Dr. Jennifer Freyd to describe a response pattern she observed repeatedly in people confronted with their harmful behavior: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. When a person using Darvo is confronted about something they have done, they deny it, then attack the person who raised the concern, and then position themselves as the real victim of the confrontation. The person who raised a legitimate concern ends up apologizing. Their concern is buried. The manipulator has escaped accountability while successfully punishing the person for raising it. Once you know this pattern, you will see it everywhere: in workplaces, in families, in political discourse, in relationships. It is extraordinarily effective because it exploits 2 of the most pro-social human instincts: the desire to avoid hurting others and the discomfort with conflict. The moment you feel responsible for the other person's distress after raising a legitimate concern, Darvo is likely in operation. The second deep pattern is what psychologists call gaslighting, the systematic undermining of another person's confidence in their own perceptions, memories, and judgment. Named after a 1944 film in which a husband manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her sanity, gaslighting works by creating a consistent gap between what the target experiences and what they are told they experienced. That never happened. You are too sensitive. You are imagining things. Everyone thinks you are overreacting. Over time, the target loses confidence in their own reality, which is precisely the point. A person who does not trust their own perceptions is maximally dependent on someone else to define reality for them. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "The most common form of human stupidity is forgetting what one was trying to do." Manipulation works partly by engineering exactly this kind of forgetting, by creating enough noise, enough self-doubt, enough distraction that the original concern gets lost in the static. The antidote to manipulation is not suspicion, it is clarity. Clarity about what you actually experienced, which requires the practice of noting your perceptions in real time rather than revising them under social pressure. Clarity about what you actually want, which requires knowing your values and priorities clearly enough that you recognize when they're being leveraged against you. And clarity about the difference between genuine persuasion, which presents evidence, respects your autonomy, and leaves you feeling more informed, and manipulation, which bypasses your reasoning, exploits your emotions, and leaves you feeling confused, obligated, or diminished. Eleanor Roosevelt, whose political acuity and emotional resilience were forged through years of navigating one of the most complex social and political environments imaginable, said something that cuts to the heart of this: "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." She did not mean that manipulation is always consciously agreed to. She meant that the foundation of manipulation's power is something inside the target, usually a need for approval, a fear of conflict, or a belief that their own perceptions cannot be trusted, and that addressing those internal foundations is the most durable form of protection. Know what you experience. Trust what you know. And remember, genuine people do not require you to doubt yourself in order to be in relationship with them. Chapter 3. The Body Speaks First. Reading Nonverbal Communication with Precision and Confidence. In 1872, Charles Darwin published a book called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. In it, he made a claim so ahead of its time that the academic world largely ignored for almost a century, that the basic emotional expressions of human beings, fear, anger, sadness, joy, disgust, surprise, were universal, not culturally learned, not different across human populations, universal, cross-cultural, and biologically rooted in our shared evolutionary history. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Paul Ekman set out to test this claim. He showed photographs of facial expressions to people in isolated tribal societies in Papua New Guinea, communities with no exposure to Western media, no shared cultural context with the people in the photographs. They identified the emotions in the images with the same accuracy as American university students. Darwin was right. The basic emotional expressions are universal. The body speaks a language that predates every spoken tongue, and it speaks it whether we intend it to or not. This is a foundation of nonverbal communication science. The body is a less consciously managed channel than speech, which means it often transmits more accurate information about a person's actual emotional state than their words do. Not always. Skilled actors and practiced deceivers can manage their nonverbal signals with remarkable precision. But for most people, in most situations, the body tells a story that the words are sometimes trying to edit. The former FBI negotiator Chris Voss, whose work in high-stakes negotiation required reading people under conditions of maximum consequence, built his entire professional methodology on the premise that what people communicate nonverbally is at least as important as what they say. He trained himself and his teams to listen not just to words, but the tone of voice, pacing, the presence or absence of mirroring, and the micro-signals that indicated whether a stated agreement was genuine or performative. The most important nonverbal signals to understand fall into 4 categories. The first is facial expressions. Specifically, the micro-expressions that Ekman identified as the brief, involuntary flickers of genuine emotion that appear on the face for fractions of a second before the conscious management layer activates. A micro-expression of contempt that flickers across a face during a flattering statement. A brief flash of fear that appears before a confident answer. These are not the primary data of reading people. They require training and practice to reliably detect, but they represent the clearest window into emotional states that the person has not chosen to display. The second category is body orientation and positioning. The human body unconsciously orients toward what it is drawn to and away from what it is threatened by or wants to escape. Feet, which are among the least consciously managed parts of the body, are particularly reliable. A person whose torso faces you but whose feet point toward the door is communicating something about their desire to leave that their words are not yet saying. A person who progressively angles their body away from another person during a conversation is communicating discomfort or desire for distance regardless of what they are saying with their face. The third category is touch and proximity. The use of physical space, how close a person positions themselves, whether they initiate contact, how they respond to proximity of others, communicates volumes about comfort, dominance, affiliation, and social intention. The person who repeatedly touches another person's arm during conversation is establishing intimacy, asserting familiarity, or subtly claiming social influence, depending on context and the other person's response. The person who creates and maintains unusually large personal space is communicating either social discomfort or desire for social distance. The fourth and most sophisticated category is consistency and congruence, the relationship between verbal and nonverbal signals. Genuine emotional states produce congruent verbal and nonverbal communication. Deception, performance, and suppression produce incongruence, mismatches between what is said and what the body simultaneously communicates. The smile that does not reach the eyes. The confident statement delivered with a collapsed posture. They express enthusiasm for a plan that is accompanied by the body language of someone who wants to be anywhere else. The psychologist Albert Mehrabian conducted research in the 1960s that produced a frequently misquoted statistic that only 7% of communication is verbal. This has been wildly misapplied. It applied specifically to the communication of feelings and attitudes, not to all communication. But the underlying principle it pointed toward is sound. In emotional and interpersonal communication, the nonverbal channels carry enormous weight. And in situations of incongruence, where words and body tell different stories, research consistently shows that observers trust the body. Sigmund Freud, whose clinical observations about human behavior remain among the most penetrating ever made regardless of the theoretical controversies around his work, wrote, "No mortal can keep a secret. If the lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore." He was not being dramatic. He was being accurate. Learn to read the conversation the body is always having, because it began long before the first word was spoken, and will continue long after the last one. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Trust. How real trust is built, broken, and accurately assessed. In 2004, researchers at the University of Zurich conducted an experiment using a simple economic game and a nasal spray. Participants who inhaled oxytocin, the neurochemical associated with bonding, connection, and social trust, showed dramatically increased willingness to extend financial trust to strangers, even when doing so left them vulnerable to exploitation. The researchers described it as evidence of trust's biological underpinnings, that the feeling of trust is a chemical state as much as a rational assessment. This finding has been widely celebrated. It is also, in the context of this book, a warning, because if trust is partly a chemical state, if it can be triggered by warmth, physical closeness, shared experience, and the sense of being seen and understood, then it is also vulnerable to being engineered by people who know which levers to pull. The con artist's warmth, the narcissist's early intensity of attention and affirmation, the manipulator's uncanny ability to make you feel, in the first hours of knowing them, more understood than you have felt by anyone in years. All of these are trust-generating machines that operate on the same biological pathways as genuine connection. This is not a reason to distrust everyone or to close yourself to connection. It is a reason to understand what genuine trustworthiness actually looks like, so you can distinguish it from its excellent imitation. The research of Brené Brown, the University of Houston professor whose study of vulnerability and trust produced one of the most watched TED Talks in history, identified what she calls the braving inventory, 7 specific components of trust that can be assessed behaviorally rather than felt emotionally. Boundaries. Does this person respect the limits you set, and do they set and maintain their own? Reliability. Do they do what they say they will do consistently over time, not just once in a high-stakes moment, but in the ordinary, unwitnessed moments when it is inconvenient? Accountability. When they make mistakes, do they own them without minimization, blame shifting, or requiring you to manage their emotional response to their own error? Vault. Do they keep confidential what you share with them in trust? And, crucially, do they keep other people's confidences around you? The person who freely shares private information about others when talking to you is demonstrating exactly how they will treat your private information when talking to someone else. Integrity. Do they choose courage over comfort? Consistently, do they do the hard or right thing rather than the easy or wrong one? Non-judgment. Can you share your struggles, failures, and fears without sensing that they're being stored as data to be used against you later or as evidence for a judgment already forming? And generosity. When your behavior or words are ambiguous, do they interpret them in the most generous possible light rather than the most suspicious or self-serving one? These 7 components share a critical feature. They're all observable over time in behavior in ordinary situations. None of them requires exceptional access or unusual circumstances to assess. They reveal themselves in the texture of daily interaction, in whether someone follows through on small commitments, in how they speak about people who are not in the room, and whether the confidences you share remain confidences. The Roman statesman and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero, who spent a lifetime navigating one of the most politically treacherous environments in history, observed, "A friend is, as it were, a second self." He understood that genuine trust, the kind that makes genuine friendship or genuine partnership possible, requires not just positive feeling, but the confidence that the other person's values, judgment, and reliability are sufficiently aligned with your own that you can extend yourself without constant vigilance. Building trust that deserves the name requires three things. The first is consistency, not the performance of trustworthiness in high-visibility moments, but the steady, unremarkable reliability in small commitments that nobody notices except over time. The second is vulnerability, the willingness to show something real rather than only the curated version, because nothing communicates, "I trust you," more clearly than allowing yourself to be seen imperfectly. The third is repair, the willingness and ability to acknowledge when you have damaged trust and take genuine, specific, behavioral action to restore it. No relationship of any duration goes without ruptures. What distinguishes trust that deepens over time from trust that erodes is not the absence of rupture, but the quality of repair. And when assessing whether the trust you are extending is warranted, remember the most reliable single test: consistency across time and across contexts. One act of reliability proves very little. 30 acts of reliability over months in different situations, under varying levels of inconvenience. That begins to mean something. Trust is built slowly, in brick-sized increments, and collapsed in a single moment. That asymmetry is not a design flaw. It is wisdom. Chapter 5, The Power Map, Understanding Social Influence and Who Really Shapes the Room. In 1959, two social psychologists named John French and Bertram Raven published a paper that classified the sources of social power into 5 types: legitimate power, which comes from formal authority or position; reward power, which comes from the ability to give people what they want; coercive power, which comes from the ability to impose consequences; expert power, which comes from knowledge or skill that others need; and referent power, which comes from being someone that others like, admire, and want to be associated with. Of these 5, the research that followed over the subsequent 60 years has consistently shown 2 things. First, coercive power, the power of fear and punishment, is the most brittle. It produces compliance without commitment, and it generates, over time, a reservoir of resentment that eventually overwhelms the structure it was used to build. Second, referent power, the power that comes from who you genuinely are rather than what position you occupy, is the most durable, the most transferable across contexts, and the most difficult to take away. The most influential person in any room is not always the person with the highest title. Sometimes it is the person everyone instinctively looks at when a decision needs to be made, the person whose judgment the room trusts, the person whose mood calibrates the mood of the group, the person who, without formally occupying any position of authority, shapes the dynamics of every interaction they enter. Understanding who actually holds influence in any social environment, and understanding why, is one of the most practically useful skills you can develop. It determines where the real conversations happen, who the gatekeepers actually are, who to build relationships with, and whose concern, if triggered, has the power to derail otherwise solid plans. The way to map social influence accurately has nothing to do with reading organizational charts. It has everything to do with watching behavior. Specifically, watch where people's eyes go when a difficult question is asked. In any group, the subtle, often unconscious behavioral response to uncertainty is to look toward the person the group trusts for orientation. The heads that turn, the eyes that seek, the pauses that wait for a particular person's reaction before committing their own. These microbehaviors reveal the actual influence architecture of the room far more accurately than any formal structure. Watch also who interrupts whom without social cost. Interruption in conversation is a micro-assertion of social status, and the absence of negative consequence to an interruption is a signal of informal authority. The person who can interrupt the room and be heard rather than resented is exercising and communicating social power, regardless of what their business card says. Nelson Mandela, whose capacity for social influence was extraordinary enough to reshape the political history of a nation, had almost none of the formal markers of power for most of his adult life. He was imprisoned, stripped of civil rights, denied a platform, and yet the influence he wielded from a cell on Robben Island was sufficient to eventually bring the most powerful government in southern Africa to a negotiating table. His power was entirely referent. The alignment of his character with his stated values, consistent over decades under conditions that would have broken most people, created a moral authority that formal power could not match or suppress. As the writer and leadership thinker John Maxwell observed, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. He was pointing at something the French and Raven research confirmed. The distinction between the authority to make people do things and the influence to inspire people to want to do them is not semantic. It is the difference between compliance and commitment, between a leader whose following evaporates when their formal power does, and one whose following deepens precisely because it was never dependent on formal power in the first place. You do not need a title to influence a room. You need credibility, the earned confidence of people who have seen your judgment prove reliable. You need consistency, the behavioral record that tells people who you will be when it costs you something. And you need genuine interest, the orientation toward other people's outcomes, not just your own. That makes people trust your motives. Map the power around you. Understand where real influence lives. And then, slowly, by being someone worth following, build yours. Chapter 6. The Emotional Intelligence Edge. The one skill that predicts success more than IQ. In 1990, two psychologists named Peter Salovey and John Mayer published a paper introducing a concept they called emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, use, understand, and manage emotions in oneself and in others. For years later, science journalist Daniel Goleman brought the concept to a mass audience in a book that generated one of the most significant debates in psychology and business of the late 20th century. His claim that emotional intelligence, EQ, was a better predictor of life success than cognitive intelligence, IQ. The debate about the precise relationship between EQ and IQ has never been fully settled. But 40 years of subsequent research have established something that even the most skeptical psychologists now accept. Emotional intelligence, however precisely defined, is a significant and partially independent predictor of success in almost every domain that involves other people, which, if you look around the actual structure of human life, is virtually every domain that matters. The reason is straightforward. Intelligence in the cognitive sense, the ability to process information, solve problems, and reason abstractly, is enormously valuable in contexts where the raw material is information and problems. But most of human life is not primarily about information and problems. It is about relationships, groups, negotiations, conflicts, motivations, trust, communication, and the endlessly complex navigation of other people's emotional realities alongside your own. In these domains, the person who can read a room, regulate their own reactions under pressure, understand what is actually driving someone else's behavior, and communicate in ways that build rather than damage connection has an advantage that raw cognitive horsepower cannot substitute for. The four-component model of emotional intelligence that Salovey and Mayer originally proposed offers the clearest framework for understanding what the skill actually consists of. The first component is perceiving emotions, the ability to accurately detect and decode emotional signals in yourself, in other people, and in the environment. The person who notices that a colleague's enthusiasm for a plan is performative rather than genuine. The person who recognizes their own irritability before it manifests as sharpness in conversation. This is the foundation without which the other components cannot operate. The second component is using emotions, the ability to harness emotional states to facilitate thought and action. Different emotional states prime different cognitive processes. Mild anxiety sharpens attention to detail. Positive affect broadens creative thinking. The right amount of emotional investment energizes sustained effort. The person who can match their emotional state to the demands of a task, who can generate the focus concern needed for careful analysis or the openness needed for creative brainstorming, has a significant practical advantage. The third component is understanding emotions, the cognitive knowledge of how emotions work, what triggers them, how they develop and change over time, how they combine and interact, and what they mean in social context. This is a dimension that allows a person to look at a situation and predict with reasonable accuracy how different people are likely to feel about it. Not because they are mind readers, but because they understand the underlying emotional logic well enough to model it. The fourth and most practically demanded component is managing emotions, the ability to regulate your own emotional responses and to influence the emotional state of others in ways that serve constructive ends. This is not suppression, the forcing of emotion underground where it accumulates force. It is regulation, the active, conscious engagement with emotional experience that acknowledges what is there works with it rather than against it, and directs it toward useful rather than destructive expression. The psychologist and researcher Dr. Daniel Siegel, whose work on the neuroscience of mindfulness and emotional regulation has influenced both therapy and education, uses the phrase "name it to tame it." The finding that labeling an emotional experience reduces its intensity by activating the prefrontal cortex and partially dampening the amygdala's alarm response. Simply saying internally or aloud, "I am feeling angry right now," does something neurological. It inserts a moment of conscious processing between stimulus and reaction, the same space that the Stoics described and that every major wisdom tradition has recognized as the seat of human freedom. Oprah Winfrey, whose extraordinary career in media required the daily exercise of emotional intelligence at the highest levels, holding space for people sharing the most painful and intimate experiences of their lives, while also navigating the political and professional complexity of running a major media operation, describe her practice in terms that map precisely onto Salovey and Meyer's model. "My philosophy is that not only are you responsible for your life, but doing the best at this moment puts you in the best place for the next moment." She was describing the management of the present moment's emotional reality, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical prerequisite for building anything worth having. Develop your EQ with the same seriousness you would develop any other professional skill. Identify your triggers before they identify you. Practice naming your emotional states in real time. Develop your capacity to sit with someone else's discomfort without rushing to resolve it. Learn to separate the information in an emotion from the impulse to act on it immediately. These are learnable skills. They are also, in the long run, among the most valuable ones you will ever develop. Chapter 7. The Art of Ethical Influence. How to move people toward better outcomes without manipulation. There's a word that makes a great many people uncomfortable when applied to themselves. Influence. We are comfortable with it as an abstract quality possessed by public figures and historical forces. We are much less comfortable with the idea that we are actively, deliberately trying to influence the people around us, even when our intentions are entirely good. This discomfort is worth examining, because the alternative to intentional, ethical influence is not the absence of influence. It is unintentional, unexamined influence of unknown quality. You influence the people around you constantly, whether you know it or not. The question is whether you do it with awareness and care, or whether you allow it to happen by default. Ethical influence, the deliberate, respectful, transparent attempt to move people toward better understandings, better decisions, or better outcomes, is one of the most essential human skills. Parents use it. Teachers use it. Doctors use it. Good leaders depend on it. And the difference between ethical influence and manipulation, far from being a matter of degree, is a categorical distinction in intent and method. Manipulation bypasses a person's rational agency. It works on them without their awareness, exploiting cognitive biases, emotional vulnerabilities, and social instincts. Its goal is to produce particular behavior regardless of whether that behavior genuinely serves the person's interests. Ethical influence works with a person's rational agency. It provides information, perspective, and experience that allows them to see more clearly and choose more freely. Its goal is to expand the person's ability to make a genuinely informed choice, even if that choice turns out to be different from the one the influencer hoped for. The research of social psychologist Robert Cialdini, whose work we encountered in our chapter on manipulation, has a second and equally important application here. Understanding the principles of influence allows you to deploy them transparently and ethically. Reciprocity deployed ethically means giving genuinely, without calculation of return, because generosity builds a kind of relationships in which people are glad to help each other. Social proof deployed ethically means sharing real examples of real people who have made a choice you are recommending and genuinely benefited from it. Authority deployed ethically means earning your expertise through genuine knowledge and being honest about its limits. The most powerful tool in ethical influence is a question that most people who think about persuasion never ask. What does this person actually need to know, feel, or experience in order to be able to genuinely agree with this? Not, how do I get them to comply? But, what would have to be true? What information, what understanding, what assurance for this to be a genuine yes rather than a pressured or confused one? This question is transformative because it shifts the entire orientation of the influencer from themselves, their goal, their argument, their need for agreement, to the other person, their perspective, their concerns, their genuine interests. And this shift, paradoxically, makes influence dramatically more effective. People who feel genuinely heard and genuinely understood are far more open to new perspectives than people who feel they're being talked at or pressured. The former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss, whose entire professional methodology was built around ethical influence in the most high-stakes imaginable contexts, identified what he called tactical empathy as the single most powerful tool available to a negotiator. Not sympathy, not agreement or approval, but the genuine, expressed effort to understand another person's perspective fully enough to demonstrate that understanding to them. The goal, he writes, is to identify what your counterparts actually need, magnetize by their emotions, and then influence them. Influence that begins with genuine understanding of the other person's reality is not only more ethical, it is more accurate. You cannot reliably help someone move toward a better outcome if you do not understand where they actually are, why they hold the positions they hold, and what the genuine concerns are beneath the stated ones. Mahatma Gandhi, whose life was a masterclass in ethical influence at scale, built a political movement that transformed a subcontinent without ever using coercion, and whose power came from his absolute alignment between stated values and personal behavior. He understood something profound about the mechanics of ethical influence. Be the change you wish to see in the world. He was not offering a bumper sticker. He was describing a strategic principle. People are influenced most durably not by what they are told, but by what they observe. And the most influential thing you can demonstrate is that the thing you are advocating for is genuinely possible, because you are living it. Influence others the way you would want to be influenced, with honesty, with respect for your intelligence, with genuine concern for your well-being, and with the courage to tell you the truth even when a comfortable lie will be more immediately welcome. That is the art. It is also the standard. Chapter 8. The Mirror Principle. Knowing yourself so well that nothing can be used against you. There is a form of psychological manipulation so sophisticated and so common that most people experience it repeatedly without ever identifying it. It works like this. The manipulator identifies something you have not fully examined in yourself, a fear, an insecurity, an unmet need, a contradiction between your stated values and your actual behavior, and they use that gap as a lever, not necessarily consciously, sometimes entirely intuitively, but with devastating effectiveness. The person who has not fully examined their need for external approval will bend themselves to accommodate unreasonable demands, because the alternative, withdrawal of approval, is genuinely threatening to them. The person who has not examined their fear of conflict will avoid necessary confrontations until small problems become crises. The person who has not examined their relationship with failure will abandon valuable projects at the first sign of difficulty, or alternatively pursue risky ventures with insufficient caution because the possibility of failure is so intolerable that they would rather not look at it clearly. Every unexamined part of yourself is a handle available to be grabbed. The ancient Delphic inscription, "Know thyself," was not a philosophical pleasantry. It was the most practically protective instruction the ancient world had to offer. Because a person who knows themselves, their genuine values, their real fears, their actual strengths and limitations, the ways in which their history has shaped their responses, is a person whose handles are not available to be grabbed by someone else, because they have already grabbed them themselves. Carl Jung described the work of self-knowledge with a concept he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or failed to integrate, usually because they seemed incompatible with the person we believe ourselves to be or the person we want others to see. The shadow contains not only the darkness, the anger, the jealousy, the self-interest that social training taught us to hide. It contains also the light, the ambition that seemed arrogant to admit, the talent that seemed dangerous to claim, the need that seemed too vulnerable to express. The shadow does not disappear because it is not acknowledged. It appears in our overreactions to situations that trigger the suppressed material, in the projections we put onto other people, in the blind spots that make us predictable to others in ways we cannot see ourselves. The person who has suppressed their competitive instincts is often the person whose secret envy poisons their most important relationships. The person who has suppressed their anger is often the person whose controlled exterior cracks catastrophically when the accumulated pressure finally overcomes the suppression. The practical work of self-knowledge has three components. The first is honest inventory, the regular, unflinching practice of examining your own behavior, patterns, and motivations without the protective layer of self-justification. Not, what did I do, but why did I actually do it? The real answer, not the socially acceptable one. Not, what do I value in the abstract, but what does my actual behavior reveal about what I value in practice when values conflict and something has to give? The second component is feedback, the deliberate, active seeking of other people's honest observations about how you come across, what patterns they see in you, where your blind spots appear to be. This is genuinely uncomfortable because it requires creating conditions in which people feel safe enough to tell you something you might not want to hear. It requires, above all, the demonstrated willingness to receive difficult information without punishing the messenger. Because the moment you punish someone for honest feedback, you have sealed yourself inside the echo chamber of only hearing what you have trained people around you to say. The third component is integration, the actual behavioral work of closing the gap between who you are in your best self-understanding and who you are in your actual behavior under pressure. This gap is never fully closed. The goal is not perfection, but progressive reduction. The gradual, incremental alignment of stated values with actual choices, of self-image with behavioral reality, of the person you present the world with the person who exists when no one is watching. The psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, whose entire intellectual contribution was built on the question of how human beings find and maintain meaning under the most extreme conditions, arrived at a conclusion that is equally applicable to the work of self-knowledge. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The work of knowing yourself is the work of expanding that space. Every time you examine a reaction rather than just having it, every time you catch the automatic response before it fires and ask whether it serves you, every time you choose rather than react, you are expanding the space in which genuine freedom lives. And as that space expands, something remarkable happens. The handles become yours. The vulnerabilities examined and integrated stop being points of exploitation and start being points of understanding and compassion. For yourself and for the people whose unexamined versions of the same vulnerabilities you can now recognize with clear eyes. Know the hidden language of others. But first and most importantly, know your own. Everything else flows from there. Conclusion. The fluent life. You have now traveled through 8 chapters of the hidden language, 8 dimensions of human psychology that most people never formally study, and that shape the quality of every relationship, every professional outcome, every social experience in their lives. You have learned to read character from behavior rather than from self-presentation, to watch the tree, not the shadow. You have learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation before they can take hold, and to build the internal clarity that is the most durable protection against them. You have learned to read the conversation the body is always having, beneath the conversation the mouth is conducting. You have learned what genuine trust is made of, the 7 behavioral components that distinguish real trustworthiness from its excellent imitation. You have learned to map the actual influence architecture of the social environments you move through, and understand where real power lives rather than where formal authority sits. You have learned the 4 components of emotional intelligence and why developing them is among the most practically valuable investments any person can make. You have learned the difference between ethical influence and manipulation and the specific orientation toward the other person's genuine understanding rather than your own desired outcome that defines the former and excludes the latter. And you have arrived at the deepest principle of all, that the most powerful protection against the hidden language being used against you is to develop an equally deep fluency in your own. Carl Jung's words with which we open this book bear returning to. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The hidden language is unconscious only to those who have never studied it. Once learned, it cannot be unlearned. The micro-expression you could not have identified last month will catch your attention next week. The manipulation pattern you could not have named last year will be visible to you within minutes of its first emergence. The body language that used to be invisible background noise will begin to speak with the volume of speech. This does not make life mechanical. It does not turn human beings into puzzles or relationships into strategic calculations. People who develop genuine social intelligence almost universally report that it deepens their compassion, because understanding why people behave the way they do, in all its messy human complexity, makes it harder to condemn and easier to understand. The hidden language is the language of what it actually means to be human. To read it fluently is to understand, with clarity and with grace, the full complexity of the world you actually live in. Read it well, use it wisely, and carry what you have learned here with both the confidence it deserves and humility that genuine understanding always produces. The language was always there. Now you can hear it.